Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I will be doing my July and August wrap-up, talking about all the books that I managed to read in the month of July and August. Before the end of July, I actually left to go visit my girlfriend Stacy in Canada, so I didn't really have a lot of time to do my wrap-up, and I got back from Canada in like the middle of August, so I was like, you know what, I might as well just wait and do a combined July and August wrap-up. So for this one, I will be talking about all of the books that I read in July and August. I have a lot of books to talk about here, so I won't be going into too much detail for all of them. I'll just give my overall opinion on all of them and my rating. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So for the first book, this is very embarrassing and I hate this, but I gotta talk about it. The first book I read was Nymphomaniacs on Big Top Island, which is a book in the Floppy Shoes Apocalypse series. And the reason I had to read this is because I lost a bet with Stacy. I didn't think she could complete 3 books in 3 days, but she did. And no more book bets with Stacy because they will end terribly. And I had to read this piece of shit. Luckily it's only like 40 pages, but good God, this was awful. It was so bad. I hated, even though it only took me like 40 minutes to read or whatever, it was so bad. Like, it was so bad. I mean, for someone who is into clown erotica, which is essentially what this is, horror clown erotica, I could see them liking it, but good God, man, this was awful. So no more book bets with Stacy. For the love of God, no. The next book I read was Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch, and this is a reread for me. It's the second book in the Gentleman Bastard series, the sequel to The Lies of Locke Lamora, one of my all-time favorite fantasy books. This is one of my all-time favorite fantasy series, one of the best sequels ever in my mind. Like, this book, even though I do prefer the first book ever so slightly, like, this book lives up to the first book, and it's so good. I love the world building stuff we get in here, and of course Locke and John are like the best friendship ever. And I'm currently rereading the third book right now, and I'm enjoying it immensely. So I had a really good time with the second book. The next book I read was on audio, and that would be Moon of the Crusted Snow. I enjoyed this book. I gave it 3.5 stars. There was some stuff that I liked about it, like the author was really good at creating an atmosphere, and it did really feel like a very unique post-apocalyptic story. My main problem was with the villain. The villain wasn't very compelling. It was very predictable. So like the second half of the book didn't really do it for me, but it did have some stuff that I enjoyed about it. Not a new favorite though. I would give it 3.5 stars. I might as well talk about these books back to back, even though I didn't read them back to back in the month of July. Oh well, it's the Fred the Vampire Accountant series. So I reread the first book, which has a very long title, which I don't want to read. And then the second book, Undeath in Texas. Very fun series. Of course, narrated by my all-time favorite narrator, Kirby Hayborn. Very funny, very just weird, dry humor. And yeah, not too much to say about it. I really like it. I feel like the series could go in the direction of Dresden, though, where Dresden, like the more books I read in the series, it felt kind of samey. Like the second book read very much like the first book, so I'm hoping that the third book will deviate a little bit because I got burnt out with Dresden. eventually. So hopefully there's a little bit more diversity because the second book did feel very much like the first book. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but I love when authors can kind of like switch it up every now and then. I do really like them, but I don't want to get burnt out on the series. So hopefully the third book is an improvement. The next book I read was another reread for me, and that would be Mr. Mercedes. And I read this because my Patreon, or on Patreon, Josephina won, and this is the book that she wanted me to read. And I did, and I enjoyed it. It's not my absolute favorite Stephen King book. It's kind of like in the middle tier, I guess. Like, I would give this book 3.5 stars. I like the plot. Like, this is a very plot-driven book, which for Stephen King is unique because most of his books are very character-driven. And that's kind of my main problem with it, actually, is that the plot's good, but he forgets to include compelling characters. There's not really a lot of great characters in this book. Some of them are very forgettable, but it is a fun, fast-paced book. So I did enjoy it, but again, not one of my favorites. The next book I read is The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. This book had a lot of great elements to it, but at the same time, it had too much going on for it. And what I mean by that is that the author almost felt compelled to just like cram in so much stuff. Like it was very unique, and a lot of the stuff was very cool. I just felt she was trying to do too much with it, and it just didn't work for me. It felt like a jumbled mess. And so while there were elements that I did like about it, overall, it just really didn't work for me. I have since unhauled my physical copy, and I will not be continuing. Not a favorite of mine. The next book I read was for the Richard Bachman read-along that me and Josephina have done and have since completed, and that would be Blaze by Richard Bachman, aka Stephen King. One of the better Richard Bachman books, in my opinion, and I won't go into too much detail because, like I said, me and Josephina did a live show for this. So if you want to if you want to see my more in-depth thoughts about it, you can go check the live show that we did over on her channel. I had a lot of fun doing that, but just know that Blaze is one of my favorite Richard Bachman books and one of my favorite King books in general. I would give it 4.5 stars. And the last book that I managed to finish in the month of July was on audio, and that would be The World's Worst Assistant by Sonat Movsesian, who is actually the assistant to one of my favorite comedians, Conan O'Brien. And he's been doing a podcast over the last few years called The Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. And it's really funny, and she's on there too. And I loved the audio, although my main complaint is that since I'm already a huge fan, I have already known like all of the stuff that she mentions in the, or not all of it, but a lot of the book wasn't very new to me. I knew a lot of the stories going into it, so not a lot of it surprised me, but it was still a fun listen. And of course, she narrated it. It was a lot of fun. I gave it 4 stars. And the first book that I finished in July was actually a book that me and Stacy were reading to each other, and that would be Dead Woman Scorned. And this is the sequel to The Patience of a Dead Man, which I thought was pretty good. The Patience of a Dead Man was like a 3.5 star read for me. It wasn't like my absolute favorite, but I did enjoy it. Dead Woman Scorned, I liked significantly less. I would give it around 2.5 stars. I had some issues with it. My main complaint overall, though, is that it's a 300-page book with 200 chapters, or almost 200 chapters. So some of the chapters are literally less than a page long, just continuously. And I'm finding that I don't really enjoy really short, choppy chapters. Like, you don't really get a lot of good character moments that way. That's why I didn't enjoy the second Faithful and the Fallen book. I enjoyed Malice, but I didn't enjoy Valor because just some of those chapters were just so short and you just don't get a lot of meat on the bones that way. And I don't know, the Dead Woman Scorned, it had some good moments. Like the first part of the book where you get a character's backstory was really good. And then there was stuff at the end that was really good. But a lot of it was just, I didn't enjoy it as much. Stacy's going to read the third book, and she's going to tell me if it's worth reading or not. So hopefully the third book is better. The next book I managed to read was another reread for Wolves of the Kala, which is book 5 in the Dark Tower series. And I would say that besides Win Through the Keyhole, like out of the main Dark Tower novels, this is my least favorite, and it's always been. It just, I'm not a huge fan of most Stephen King chunky books, and there's a chunk in the middle here that I really just can't really get into, and I can't talk about it because of spoilers, obviously, but it's a character backstory that I'm just not a fan of. And overall, this book tries to do so much, which makes sense because Stephen King wrote this after his accident, and he kind of just wanted to get The Dark Tower written before he died, right? And because of that, this just feels so messy, and just so much is trying to get accomplished in here. There are aspects that I really love about this book, but there's some that I don't. So overall, not a bad book. I'd give it 3 stars, but definitely my least favorite of the Dark Tower novels. The next book I read during my flight home from Canada, and this book was a severe disappointment, and that would be Gwendys Magic Feather. And this is the sequel to Gwendys Button Box, which I actually really like. That's one of my favorite Stephen King novellas. So I was excited, but also apprehensive for this book because it's solely written by Richard Chizmar, and I was severely disappointed with this novella. And again, the short chapters come up because this is like a 200-page book, but there's like 80 chapters. So some of the chapters, you just read them and they're a page or 2 long. Nothing of significant happens in them. And pretty much this book is that. Like, not a lot of significant stuff happens in this book. And it was just so boring. Like, this book was so boring. And that I know that's completely subjective, and I know some people love it, but for me, I was just bored to tears. I gave this book 2 stars. Of course, I was able to finish it, so I'm not going to give it 1 star, but good God, this book does not hold a candle to Gwendys Button Box and how good that one is. I really did not like this, so I'm a little apprehensive about Gwendy's final task. But Stephen King did help to write that one, so hopefully it'll be better than this garbage. The next book I read, I was very excited for, and again, severely disappointed, and that would be the audio of The Babysitter Lives by Stephen Graham Jones. He's quickly becoming one of my favorite writers, and I was very much looking forward to this because it was only on audio, so I got the audiobook, and I was super excited for it, and I was so let down. This book, like with Gwendys Magic Feather, it was just so boring. And most Stephen Graham Jones books that I read, even though they can be a little slow-paced at times, or they're kind of a fever dream and you're not quite sure what's going on, they're very interesting, and interesting things happen in them. But that was not the case with The Babysitter Lives. I really didn't enjoy most of this. And I feel like if I had a physical copy, I could have gotten into it a bit more, because this book is sort of a fever dream where you're not quite sure what's going on. So a lot of the times with books like that, I can go back and flip the page in the physical page and reread some stuff, but it's really hard to do that on audio. So this was a really weird choice for Stephen Graham Jones to only do this on audio. I did not enjoy my experience for most of this. Again, not terrible. I gave it 2.5 stars, but definitely my least favorite of his books so far. The next book I read is Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut, and the reason I picked this up was because the winner for Guess the Beach for the month of July was B.C. Fortenberry, and this is the book he chose for me to read as the winner. And I've read a few Kurt Vonnegut books. Some of them I've really enjoyed. Some of them were kind of a dud for me. So I was curious about this book. and it's one of BC Fortenberry's favorite Kurt Vonnegut books. So I figured I'd give it a shot, and I really did enjoy it. I gave it 4 stars. I read along with the audio. The audio was very good. Again, very typical Kurt Vonnegut book, very quirky, very satirical. I loved it. I gave it 4 stars, and it makes me want to read more Kurt Vonnegut because I haven't really read him in a long time. So this was definitely a success. The next book I read was Rage, which is in the Bachman books. Rage, easily my least favorite of the Bachman books. And I won't go into too much detail because I did a rant review for it about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. I don't know, but I talked a lot about it and why I severely dislike this book. It's, like I said, easily my least favorite Richard Bachman book. This is a reread for me. I knew I wasn't going to like it, and yeah, I don't really have too much to say. I don't like this book. The next book I decided to pick up was Cage of Souls by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, I had previously read Children of Time and Children of Ruin, and I really enjoyed those books, especially Children of Time. Adrian Tchaikovsky is just a very imaginative and very creative writer. This book, even though it's called Cage of Souls, I didn't think it was actually going to take place on a prison, but that's what it is. And it's sort of post-apocalyptic and like dying Earth. And it was so good and so imaginative. I loved the structure of this book where it flashes back between the present and the past. Man, this book, again, just the word that keeps coming to mind with Adrian Tchaikovsky is imaginative and creative. So I definitely can see him becoming one of my favorite sci-fi authors, and I definitely need to read more of his stuff because Cage of Souls was excellent. The next book I read was a book that me and Stacy actually read together. We read it very quickly, and that would be Sphere by Michael Crichton. This is probably my all-time favorite Michael Crichton. It was a reread for me, and it was Stacy's first time not only reading this book, but any Michael Crichton. So I was very excited to read this to her and for her to read it to me. I love this book, and I loved it again. Gave it 4.5 stars. Yeah, Michael Crichton, one of my, not a top 10 anymore, but one of my all-time favorite writers, and I had a really good time reading this with Stacy. So the next book I read is actually another reread. I've been doing a lot of rereading this year. Hopefully next year I won't do as much so I can actually get to newer books. But whatever. The book is Alloy of Law by Brandon Sanderson. It's the first book in the Era 2 of Mistborn, and I actually prefer Mistborn Era 2, which I know is very unpopular, but whatever. Fight me. Era 2 starts out with Alloy of Law. Loved it. 4.5 stars. I actually recently reread the second book already, which I also gave 4.5 stars, but I'll talk more about that in my September wrap up. But yeah, I'm getting very excited for the release of The Lost Metal, which is the 4th and final book in Era 2, which comes out in November. So I've been rereading these books to kind of catch up on that. So yeah, I really liked Alloy of Law. And probably my favorite books that I reread and read in the past 2 months have been The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell, one of my all-time favorite books from her, and of course the sequel, which came out in August, The Family Remains, which I also gave 5 stars. I loved it. I think I do prefer the first book because the overall reading experience of this is a little better for me. The Family Remains, it actually took me a little bit of time to get into one of the storylines, but once it got going, it was so good. And of course, just masterfully done by one of my all-time favorite authors, Lisa Jewell. I'm actually considering making her my 3rd favorite author of all time, and to surpass Brandon Sanderson. I kind of wish I would have waited to do my top 10 authors video, because I'm pretty sure I'd put her in my third spot. Just everything I read by her is magnificent, and yeah, just oh, I'm just gushing over her at this point. Yeah, Family Upstairs and The Family Remains, both 5 stars. The next book that I read in August was Shorefall by Robert Jackson Bennett, which this is the sequel to Foundryside. I did prefer Foundryside slightly more because I think overall that book was better from start to finish. This book took me a little bit of time to get invested. Like it was still good. Like I was reading the first half and I was like, this is good. More of a 4-star read, not quite as good as the first book. But then the second half kicks in and there's just so much chaos that happens and really cool character moments that I really enjoyed the second half of this book. And I can't wait to get to the third book, Locklands, in September. Of course, me and Stacey are going to buddy read it. She got me into the series, and I can't wait to finish out the trilogy. And the last book that I managed to finish in the month of August was one of the most anticipated books of the year for me, and that would, of course, be Carrie Soto is Back by none other than Taylor Jenkins Reid. I loved this book, and I was definitely expecting to love it, but I didn't give it 5 stars. I gave it 4.5 stars. There were some slight issues for me, and as far as like my ranking for Taylor Jenkins Reid's books, it would definitely be lower because I've given 4 for books 5 stars, and then another one I gave 4.5 stars. So this would actually be probably number 5 on the list because I love Daisy Jones and the Six, Malibu Rising, Evelyn Hugo, Maybe in Another Life. It's not quite on the same level as those books, but still, I loved this book. I'm actually probably going to be doing a dedicated book review for this, so look out for that probably sometime next week while I gather my thoughts on it. But yeah, I just know that I still loved this book, and it was really good. I gave it 4.5 stars. All right, that's probably a long video. Thank you for watching. Those are all the books that I read in the month of July and August. So let me know what you guys thought of this video. Let me know what your favorite books of July and August were. And yeah, thank you guys for watching and have a fantastic day.